This is Land of Havilah, Leviticus 3, which is Yahweh's instructions for presenting a peace offering. Like all offerings, it'll be at the tabernacle. This procedure is different than the burnt offering and for a different purpose. The burnt offering was for atonement in chapter 1. The peace offering here in chapter 3 is for fellowship. Speaking of the person who brings the animal for peace offering, verse 1, if his offering is a sacrifice of peace offerings, if he offers it from the herd, whether male or female, he shall offer it without defect before Yahweh. Comment, that's peace offering, P-E-A-C. A peace offering is brought by a person who's already at peace with God. And how is he at peace with God? As verse 5 is about to say, it's because he just put down a burnt offering. So a peace offering is a secondary offering. First, a burnt offering for atonement goes down, and the peace offering goes on top of it, literally on top of it on the altar. That's because in the relationship between God and man, atonement is always first. We have zero relationship to God unless there's atonement. Atonement establishes a relationship since it covers our sin and makes us acceptable to Him. That's always first between God and man, atonement. Then comes fellowship and relationship, which is what the peace offering is all about. In the practice of ancient Israel, it might be possible that the person didn't put down his own burnt offering because the priest will be performing the burnt offering of one lamb every morning and evening for all Israel, Numbers 28:3. So a person's peace offering could go on top of that burnt offering, but it must go on top of some burnt offering, as verse 5 will say. As for atonement, the cross was a done deal at creation, 1 Peter 1:20 and Revelation 13:8, in the sense that from the foundation of the world, God already planned the cross and committed to the cross. So even for the ancient Israelite, Christ's sacrifice was already a given. When the Israelite offered an animal for atonement, he was really availing himself of the blood of Christ without fully knowing what he was doing. It only mattered that God knew it. These people were, in a sense, Christians without knowing it, because by coming to the tabernacle and presenting an offering for burnt offering, they were doing it in faith. It's the same for Christians, that we come in faith, with the difference being that God provided the sacrifice of Christ for us. But back to the peace offering, in verse 1 it was either male or female, and in this section it's speaking of cattle. Now, speaking of the person who brings it, verse 2, he shall lay his hand on the head of his offering and kill it at the door of the tent of meeting, and Aaron's sons, the priests, shall sprinkle the blood around on the altar. Comment, when the person lays his hand on the animal's head, it's symbolizing that he's the one bringing the animal. And when we visualize that, it symbolizes our contacting Christ. And as we'll find out, the person bringing this offering might have thanksgiving on his mind, or he might be making a request of Yahweh as he's performing this sacrifice, or he might have already made a vow to Yahweh, as in, Yahweh, if you do such and such for me, I'll bring you a peace offering. And if that was the case, his peace offering is in payment of that vow. Or it might not be any of those things. He might be empty of every thought except that he just wants to reach out to Yahweh. So after laying his hand on the animal's head, there's the killing, then sprinkling of the blood around on the altar, which is all about Christ to us. When we read this, we see more a vision of the bloody cross than we do the bloody altar. And by the way, all the types of offerings in the chapters to come and the ones we've already read are pictures of the crucifixion as well. Verse 3, he shall offer the sacrifice of peace offerings, an offering made by fire to Yahweh, the fat that covers the innards, and all the fat that is on the innards, and the 2 kidneys, and the fat that is on them, which is by the loins, and the cover on the liver with the kidneys he shall take away. Aaron's sons shall burn it on the altar, on the burnt offering, which is on the wood that is on the fire. It is an offering made by fire, of a pleasant aroma to Yahweh. Comment, that's the completion of the peace offering for cattle. Only small portions of the animal went onto the altar, namely certain fatty parts plus the kidneys. Your narrator is a retired physician and can tell you that the kidneys are surrounded by fat. Thus he can vouch that verse 4 is anatomically correct when it speaks of, quote, the 2 kidneys and the fat that is on them, end quote. The same goes for the cover of the liver in verse 4, which is called the omentum. It's a structure that a fatty structure that hangs down from the liver. Later in Leviticus, we learn that the priest who tended the altar will keep the right thigh, and the chest meat also will go to the priests in general. So again, the priests get a commission, so to speak, like they did of the burnt offerings and meal offerings. Most of the animal remains, unlike the burnt offering, and will be taken back to the person's lodging for him and his family, all of it except the blood, the fatty parts, the kidneys, the right thigh, and the breast. He and the family will eat the animal in fellowship with God, as in 1 Samuel 1:4. Oftentimes at festivals and gatherings of all Israel, the kings provided thousands of peace offerings and fed the people with them, 2 Chronicles 30:24. Thus the peace offerings shared between Yahweh, the priest, the priesthood in general, the person who gives it, his house, his friends, or his royal subjects in some cases. It's a communion of all of them together. Verses 1 to 5 were for cattle. Coming up for lambs, it's almost identical. Verse 6. If his offering for a sacrifice of peace offerings to Yahweh is from the flock, male or female, he shall offer it without defect. If he offers a lamb for his offering, then he shall offer it before Yahweh, and he shall lay his hand on the head of his offering and kill it before the tent of meeting, and Aaron's son shall sprinkle its blood around on the altar. He shall offer from the sacrifice of peace offerings an offering made by fire to Yahweh. Its fat, the entire tail fat, he shall take away close to the backbone, and the fat that covers the inwards, and all the fat that is on the inwards, and the 2 kidneys, and the fat that is on them, which is by the loins, and the cover on the liver, with the kidneys he shall take away. The priest shall burn it on the altar. It is the food of the offering made by fire to Yahweh. Comment in verse 7, this is the section dealing with lambs for peace offerings. In verse 9, it's a little different for lambs than for cattle because the fat of the tail should go to the altar along with the other fatty parts. Now for goats, verse 12, if his offering is a goat, then he shall offer it before Yahweh, and he shall lay his hand on its head and kill it before the tent of meeting, and the sons of Aaron shall sprinkle its blood around on the altar. He shall offer from it as his offering, an offering made by fire to Yahweh, the fat that covers the innards and all the fat that is on the inwards, and the 2 kidneys and the fat that is on them, which is by the loins, and the cover on the liver with the kidneys, he shall take away. The priest shall burn them on the altar. It is the food of the offering made by fire for a pleasant aroma. All the fat is Yahweh's. Comment in verses 11 and 16 for sheep and goats, the fatty parts are, quote, the food of the offering made by fire to Yahweh, end quote, and a, quote, pleasant aroma, end quote, to Yahweh. So Yahweh's sharing in the enjoyment of the sacrifice as if he were smelling it and eating it. Yahweh thinks enough of this atoned fellow to sit down and eat with him, as he sat down and ate with Abraham, Genesis 18, and with us, Revelation 3:20, quote, behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into him and will dine with him, and he with me, end quote. Coming up, ancient Israelites should at no time eat fat or blood, verse 17. It shall be a perpetual statute throughout your generations in all your dwellings that you shall eat neither fat nor blood. Comment, an ancient Israelite shouldn't eat fat or blood. This will remind them of the function of fat and blood in their offerings. Why does a peace offering involve fatty parts? Fat smells good going up in smoke, and in an ancient society that was grazing animals in a semi-arid region, their animals had very little fat, so fat was precious. Fat was the best. And why the kidneys? Maybe because the kidneys are the innermost parts. Anatomically, they're the deepest, most inaccessible organs. Israelites associated the kidneys with their feelings and passions. We might say, I feel it in my gut. They might say, I feel it in my inward parts or my kidneys. So by placing the fat and kidneys on the altar, they were offering their best and innermost to Yahweh. Pray with me, please. Father, in faith, I lay my hands on Christ and thank you for the sacrifice he performed with me in mind. Thank you for the peace between us that you created. Amen. Leviticus 4 is next at landofhavilah.net.